Seconds.
Mhm.
Welcome back to Beyond the Bench, the podcast from Mountain States Legal Foundation, where we explore the cases, people, and principles shaping the fight for liberty in America. Today, we are joined by the Institute Executive Vice President of Advanced Colorado, former chairwoman of the Colorado Republican Party, member of the State Board of Education, and fellow podcaster, Kristi Burton Brown. Kristi, it is great to have you, and thank you for joining us for a conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.
So, just to kind of get a little bit of, I guess, a little bit more background on you, just like, I mean, obviously we got a couple of introductory sentences, but for those who may not know you, feel free to elaborate more on who you are, what you do, and how you've gotten to where you are today.
Sure. Well, I mean, you you covered a lot of it, but I also have three kids, so love being a mom and having family time. My son plays hockey. My daughter loves speech and debate. So I think, we just like being a Colorado family and experiencing a lot of the things out in nature that our state offers. I am also a constitutional attorney, so love following what goes on at the Supreme Court. Love all of your work at Mountain States Legal. I think you guys take on some really important cases to preserve our rights. And I guess that's probably the core of what I've always wanted to do, both in law and politics, is preserve like equal rights for human beings. It's something I'm just really passionate about.
And so I actually read an interesting fact about you recently, and I kind of want to just touch on it a little bit and just kind of get to know you a little bit better as well. But you started law school at the age of 17, correct?
Yeah, I did.
One, that's a absolutely astonishing accomplishment. But you also then continued to build a career around constitutional law, like kind of just what you talked about. But what first drew you to the Constitution as something worth defending professionally?
Sure. Well, I originally got interested when I was 13 years old. I was, I guess, one of those people that put
My
political
gosh.
posters on the walls of my bedroom instead of like band posters. So, just started following government and the political and legal things when I was a teenager. I was homeschooled, so my parents like had a ton of really great conversations with us around the dinner table. And my dad's theory was very much like, you're here to help other people. I'm a Christian. I think that informs my worldview as well. Like, we're not just here for ourselves. We're here to go, bring light and equality and important things to other people's lives. And I think the American Constitution really speaks to that. It is the longest lasting founding document across the world. And so for me, I think looking at vulnerable populations and saying, like, who isn't experiencing full equality and the full scope of their rights? It can be different state to state. It can be different at certain times. When I got into law school, it was the pro-life issue that really motivated me. That still remains like top of my list. But I think the older I get, the more that you can see just different people also who are discriminated against in different ways, and the way that the Constitution provides a way for their rights to go be defended and preserved in the United States.
So you kind of touched on a little bit more of like your focus, and I've seen that a lot of your focus is within constitutional law and is drawn particularly towards free speech and equal protection. So what
Mhm.
about those two amendments kind of catches your attention compared to really any others?
Sure. Well, like you said, no, I think the entire Constitution is made up of, very unique amendments, and any of them could be talked about at length. But it is the first and 14th, yes, that I think like spending most of my time on. I heard something really interesting from, I think it was former U.S. Senator Ben Sasse recently talking about the First Amendment. And he talked about how there's a lot packed into it when we look at freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, free exercise of religion, no government establishment of religion. And like, why is all of that packed into one amendment? And I think when you really think about it and you evaluate legal cases, you can see it's so interconnected. And you can't experience each of those freedoms if you don't have all of those freedoms often in a nation. And so I think because the First Amendment deals with so many core issues of expressing our beliefs and sharing them with other people, and sort of the principle that I think we've lost in the US today, that like you can actually disagree with someone and not try to silence them. We're a nation that welcomes conversation, and the government especially shouldn't be shutting down the voices of people that are in the minority. And so I think that's probably especially what attracts me to the First Amendment, is that it does preserve the rights of the minority, whoever they may be in a certain situation or state or nation at the time. And then I think when you look at the 14th Amendment, it is the Equal Protection Clause in particular, like you said, that I think just really drives home what it means to be an American. This particular case I really like, Levy versus Louisiana, came down in the 1960s. And it says that in order to, be qualified for equal protection of the law, there's 3 requirements. You have to be alive, you have to be human, and you have to have your being. Some of the most basic requirements for any constitutional test out there that exists. And just, again, really drives home that narrative that in America, if you are a human being, you deserve equal protection, equal rights under the law. So I think those are some of the core reasons why I love those 2 amendments.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, a lot of law comes down to the philosophical aspect, the ethos, the pathos. But then, you talk about the logistical aspect. There's different steps, there's different tiers, there's different levels of the courts, as well as, you also have your legislative side. And even talking a little bit more on, politics and policy before you even got into that, into your leadership, particularly, you worked directly on legislation as a political analyst, for Colorado Senator Tim Neville. Is that correct?
Yep, you got. Mhm.
And how do you think that experience shaped the way you view courts versus legislatures today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think there's an interesting interplay in the American legal system and political system where our founders specifically created checks and balances so that no one branch of government is too powerful, but that all the branches are like co-equal and have their own duties and responsibilities to the people. So I do think the fact that I'm able to kind of work both with the legislative process and through the courts is just really eye-opening to see, I think, why those checks and balances are so necessary and how our government system avoids becoming a dictatorship or, really, despite the attempts of some people, it doesn't step outside like the democratic republic that we were designed to be. And so, yeah, even in my current role at Advance Colorado, we do, speak into some of the legislative bills that are proposed. And also here in Colorado, as you know, we have a unique opportunity as citizens to put ballot measures on the ballot with citizens collecting signatures and pass bills that maybe the legislature is unwilling to do. And so I think, and those can get appealed in court. And often the Colorado Supreme Court has a final say on whether or not something can get on the ballot, or whether the legislature violated like their single subject responsibility, or, federal courts can say whether or not they violated the federal Constitution. And Colorado has been struck down a number of times by the U.S. Supreme Court, specifically for violating First Amendment rights through bills that the legislature has passed, or through the work of different commissions, like the Civil Rights Commission in Colorado. So, yeah, I think participating in that process opened my eyes to the different facets that each branch of government is responsible for.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you talk about the judicial impact, and speaking into the legislative impact as well. Colorado is just such a big trending state with, news of the courts will fix it, right? We often hear that. But what are the real limits of judicial, I guess, solutions to cultural or political problems most people may not know about?
Sure, and that's a very good and deep question. I think there's probably a lot of answers to that. But I think, like the executive branch and like the legislative branch, the judicial branch does have limits as well. And, I think specifically if you're talking from the conservative angle, and our current Supreme Court is more on the conservative side, you have a lot of originalist jurists who are going to look at the Constitution and say, this particular case sitting in front of me isn't just about my opinion, which I think sometimes the legislative process can be a lot more about like a particular politician's opinion. But when you're talking about the judicial branch, they're literally supposed to evaluate, the 4 corners of that document and say, what is the Constitution? How does that inform this law that was passed by a state, or this particular circumstance that this, plaintiff has brought to the court? And so I do think we've seen a return to better originalist constitutional interpretation with the current court. And of course, if you look at what the Supreme Court has done through the decades, we see periods of time where the court really strayed away from an originalist intent and, wanted to see the Constitution grow with a growing nation, which just really allows, I think, liberal justices to extend the Constitution into an area where the founders really weren't intending it to go. And so now I think you see the court reining it back in and saying, what did the First Amendment really mean? What did the Second Amendment really mean? What is an equal protection clause in the 14th? How does that really apply to different groups of people, whether they be parents or, like I said, particular minority groups? And so I find that very fascinating, just to see the court kind of pull back to those limits of the Constitution and hopefully stay centered there.
Yeah, I agree, and I love how you brought up the topic, I guess, of you can interpret both the Constitution, and a lot of people have different opinions as well. Like you can interpret it as a growing document, as written, right? And then that really, I guess, that creates a giant emphasis on political, like policy advocacy as well as litigation. So. Let's
Hmm.
talk about Advanced Colorado a little bit more, and your role of that, and how it is a prime example of how policy organizations and legal foundations much like MSLF, complement each other. So, Advanced Colorado works upstream of the courts. In your opinion, how do you see policy advocacy and impact litigation working together?
I do think they pair together very nicely, just because of how the American political system was designed. And what I like about the policy avenue, and this, yes, is what Advanced Colorado, one of the things we focus on, the policy avenue can often go straight to the people. And I think that is one of the ideas that America was founded on, that the people should have an outsized say in how their government operates. That while we do have representatives in Congress and in the state and in the executive branch, the voice of the people should never be drowned out. It's one of the foundational, I guess, fundamentals of the First Amendment in all those rights to free speech, freedom of religion, etc., is that people have a say in what they participate in what laws they want their representatives to pass. And so I think, at Advanced Colorado, we do talk a lot to the general public. And using the ballot initiative process in Colorado, let the people make decisions on issues they care about, whether it be public safety or more choice in education or our taxpayer bill of rights here in Colorado, and fight those battles on behalf of and with the people of Colorado. Sometimes when the legislature and the legislative branch as a whole is out of touch with what the people want. And then I think to your point, all of that can pair very well with the judicial branch, and sometimes you do have to go to courts, obviously, to have that final preservation or review of people's rights. And especially if the legislature or a different branch of government is not letting people exercise their voice or is passing policy that's really detrimental and unconstitutional, whether it be the Colorado Constitution or the federal Constitution, you can go to courts and have yet another attempt at really giving the people their voice. And I think that's really important work that you guys do at Mountain States. I know we've worked with you before on cases on the First Amendment, and just really admire the work you guys put into defending people here in our state.
Well, we'll always take the compliment. We appreciate it as well, Christy.
Yeah.
But from your vantage point, how important are organizations like MSLF or even just general legal foundations, nationally, in pushing back when states, whether it is Colorado or just in general, like overreach?
I think they're essential. We have a representative form of government, like we talked about with our politicians, but our legal system also allows, advocates who are often attorneys who go to court and advocate for people. And what I think is really important about organizations like Mountain States Legal or the cases we take on in Advanced Colorado, I could name, Alliance Defending Freedom. I'm an allied attorney with them. They're sort of a counterpart to ACLU on the national stage. I think what's really important about a lot of those organizations is they take on cases pro bono for people who otherwise couldn't afford to fight the state or the federal government or whatever branch of government it is when they stomp all over people's rights. And I think that's why organizations like that are so vital, is because instead of the government then being allowed to trample over the rights of someone who doesn't have the financial or other ability to challenge them in court, you can have the ability of an experienced organization to come alongside you and put government in check and push back on that overregulation or unconstitutional violations.
Absolutely. And it's especially being an attorney, I feel like a lot of it is balancing, both mentally as well as, quite I guess physically, the laws both now and then also trying to look forward towards the future, this kind of existential of where does this lead us to? What could this lead to? And so kind of looking more on the big picture and more forward, what should citizens better understand about their constitutional rights that they often take for granted?
I think the interplay between constitutional rights is something that people don't think about quite enough. I think it's really easy to pick like your favorite rights, and I do the same thing. I think any lawyer probably does. And but I think, and that's fine, you can have your favorite right and the one you like to exercise the most. That's great. It's part of being an American. But really understanding that, if you really value your freedom of religion, for example, but you don't value other people's right to free speech, that's what is going to eventually eat away at your right to express your religious views if we don't support the freedom of speech of all Americans. And just the breadth, I think, of some of the rights too that were envisioned by our founders, like in the Equal Protection Clause, that has been narrowed too much, I think, throughout the decades at different points in America's history. You can absolutely point to different parts of our history where certain people groups were like excluded or even still are excluded from the equal protection of the laws. And so really understanding that every constitutional right is interconnected. Every right is broad enough to encompass every group of human beings, and rights aren't just about my rights, but about also protecting the rights of others. And, for anyone who really likes to get into the weeds, there's a professor, his name is Randy Barnett, and he's written a really great book called it's The Original Meaning of the 14th Amendment. And it's a huge book. But I think if everyone, even, every couple years decided to just dive into a particular amendment and really the meaning of our rights there and how it helps us stand up for others and for our own rights and push back against an overreaching government, I think we'd be much more well-educated citizens if we dove into it like that.
Agreed. Yeah, a lot of it comes back down to education. Knowledge is power, and especially when you're talking about the next generation, right? That's a lot of what Colorado advocacy kind of does, right? They kind of not advocate just for, the general public, but especially that next generation. So when we're speaking about young attorneys or even law students who care about liberty, what paths do you think are most impactful, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to think you can have an impact in any path you choose if you're really centered on something other than just building your own career. I think if and it's easy sometimes as a young attorney to say, "Ooh, I want to go make a name for myself. I want to go be a pioneer in this field of law, or make a bunch of money, or pay back all my law school debt, or whatever the issue is." But I think if you can really remember that being an attorney is about being an advocate. And so which people are you choosing to advocate for? Whose rights are you choosing to defend? And I think keeping that as one of the core goals of your mission over your career as an attorney, and letting that help, I think, direct your path too, because there are so many legal avenues that are available. And I'm not of the opinion that AI is going to replace a really good lawyer, because at least currently AI is getting a lot of legal and political issues wrong. A lot of the research is actually quite bad right now. And so you do need attorneys who are skilled enough to, I think, distinguish between cases and be able to read cases and interpret how that applies to your particular client's rights in that case. And that's a skill that's hard to teach, a robot or a machine. And so I think really developing your thinking and problem solving skills, and then, like I said, centering your career choices on whose rights you're choosing to defend, and remembering that you are an advocate. That's the field you got into, not some big money-making thing. Maybe that works out for you, maybe it doesn't. But advocating for people's rights is the core goal of being any kind of attorney.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's always, there's the logistical aspect of, making money, and I know I don't some people do fall into that hole as well, but it's, there's also a moral and ethical, I think, responsibility, especially when you get into the constitutional law, right? And so kind of even talking back on conversations, like it could be a growing document or it could be interpreted as written. It could come down to, at the end of the day, a job that a robot could never do, right? You do need that aspect of how does this affect us morally, ethically? When you look
Yeah.
ahead 10 years, what gives you the most concern and what gives you the most hope about the future of constitutional governance?
Ooh, that's a good question too. I think the biggest concern is just that we always need people to be vigilant. The reason our Constitution has stayed in place for so long is because there always have been people willing to go defend it. And I just think it's important to remind people that our constitutional rights are against the government. That is why, privately owned businesses can say, hey, inside my business, you can't talk like X, or inside my business, you can't carry a firearm. And that's why you can't go sue them over that, because your rights to keep and bear arms, your rights to free speech are as opposed to the government. And so I think if people forget that, and not that like I'm not advocating for like an adversarial relationship against the government also does a lot of great things. But I think just being vigilant to say like, where is the government stepping into people's rights? Where are they encroaching and taking more than they rightfully have the ability to do under the Constitution? And I think if people set their sights more on the government and holding them in check instead of attacking other people and private businesses and things like that, I do think we would be more successful in preserving the type of government we have. So I think that's, both something to watch out for and something to be hopeful for, that I do think the federal courts right now in particular are doing a lot better job of holding lower governments or government agencies and even the federal government in check and saying, really remember the Constitution was written for the people. So I think that's, what I'm both worried about and hopeful about when I look at the future.
That's awesome. I love to hear it too. A little hope, a little hope. A lot of people try to say it's existential and we're all doomed. There
Yeah,
is
no,
people that
hope.
we need that hope a little bit.
Uh-huh.
I guess one of my final questions is, are there any constitutional cases that you're looking at right now that you believe deserve more attention or spotlight, and why?
Sure, there's actually a couple that are having oral arguments tomorrow that involve the Equal Protection Clause. I did file an amicus brief in them. I won't be attending oral arguments, unfortunately, but I think they're going to be really interesting for anyone who wants to listen to them. One of the cases is Little versus Hecox, and it's two cases like paired together. And it's a very modern issue, right, of whether or not trans athletes should be allowed to compete in female sports, specifically like in high school and junior high, and can states limit that? Is that a violation of equal protection in any form, whether it be against the trans athletes or whether it be against females who want equal protection in their own sports? And obviously, I'm sure anyone can guess that my amicus brief was on behalf of female athletes, including gold medalist Olympians, who believe that women deserve their own place in sports. For physical protection reasons and so many other reasons that I won't get into. But I do think that's like a very modern issue that impacts the Equal Protection Clause. The Supreme Court, again, is hearing oral arguments tomorrow. So that's definitely one to watch that could set the tone of what states are and aren't allowed to do. And then another one that's a little more, I think, focused on the First Amendment rather than the 14th, and it was already decided, but Mahmoud versus Taylor. I think that's one a lot of people are interested in just seeing how far that gets extended. And that was involving parents' rights to opt their children out of certain classes, teaching, curriculum in schools. And I think a particularly interesting point in that is that they said you can't condition people's right to public education on surrendering religious exercise. And if a school was particularly teaching something that was like hostile to religious belief or put too high of pressure on kids to conform to what like the government, because schools are run by the government, was teaching, then that violated their rights. And so I think a lot of people are just interested to see, that was kind of a landmark case that built on Yoder from decades ago. How far does that go with parental rights and students' rights, as opposed to what the school is allowed to choose as a government institution teaching kids? So I think those are two modern issues on First Amendment and equal protection that are going to be really interesting to see what the court decides on one hand, and then follow the fallout or extension in the Mahmoud case.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, you're a very busy person. Sounds like you got your hand in a lot of pots, but also there's a lot of big questions to be answered, and we need someone to answer those and at least help put us in the right direction. And I guess we did ask a lot of questions today, but my last one for you, Kristi, is there anything, or sorry, if you were to leave listeners with one question from today's conversation, what would it be? I'm gonna flip the script on you a little bit.
Okay, ask a question for listeners. That's a good one. I should use this in my podcast. But yeah, I think a lot of people absorb a lot of information, but I think asking yourself, what can you offer? And how can you be involved in preserving people's rights? I don't think you have to be a lawyer to do it. I don't think you have to be a politician to do it. I think it is in America, like there are so many ways you can come alongside your neighbors, your friends, different vulnerable human beings whose rights aren't fully protected yet. And just ask yourself how you can come alongside them and what you can do to do your part to preserve like the American dream in making sure those rights extend to every single human being and not just a few and not just the majority.
Amazing, Kristi. And I couldn't have said it any better. And that was the perfect cherry on top. And that was all the questions I have, as well as we're kind of running out of time as well. So I just want to make sure that we thank you for joining us, number one, and for your insights as well into the going fight to preserve our constitutional freedoms. So if you enjoyed this conversation today, make sure to subscribe and follow Beyond the Bench wherever you get your podcasts, and visit mslegal.org to learn more about how you can stand with us in defending the Constitution. My name's Noah Dieskau, and I've been joined by the wonderful Kristi Burton Brown, and we will see you next time to go Beyond the Bench. And boom. Oh, and we're stopped recording. Yeah, but yeah, perfect timing.